Well, this is Father Vogel. We continue our series of St. Francis DeSales' Introduction to the Devout Life. We're looking at part 3 of his book, in which he speaks of the different virtues. And we've, in the past several videos, been talking about the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We now finish that topic with a final video on poverty. We've already looked at 2 forms of poverty, the forms of spiritual poverty to be lived in the time of richness, as well as an actual physical poverty that can be lived in the midst of richness. And then in this chapter we look at, well, how to be spiritually rich even in the midst of physical poverty. So St. Francis DeSales says, if you're really poor, dearest Philothea, be such also in spirit. So just because someone is physically poor doesn't mean that they are poor in spirit automatically, because it has to do with an interior attitude. He says, what cannot be changed except simply because it is God's will out of love. So obviously this doesn't prevent somebody who is poor to try to gain and have a better lifestyle, and obviously that's not what Jesus says, that you have to remain exactly where you are. But if you have no control, if it's something that you just can't change, to accept that this is God's will for you at that moment and out of love for Him. He says to have patience because you're in good company. Our Lord, Our Lady, the apostles, and so many men and women saints have been poor. They've been poor. They've even sought it out. So you're in good company. It's being really poor in the world doesn't in any way exempt us from the real spiritual riches of God. In fact, so many of the saints and Mary and Jesus, they lived that because they knew that it kept them more open to receive from God. He says the saints have sought out poverty, but you have met it without searching for it and without pain. So embrace it then as the dear friend of Jesus Christ, who was born, lived, and died in poverty, which was his nurse throughout his life. So many of the great saints, they had to specifically try to seek out and learn, how do I live in poverty, especially some that had been quite rich beforehand. But for you, if you're living in real physical poverty already, then you had to do no work to find it. It found you, and so now you share very closely in the same state as our Lord Jesus. He says that this kind of real poverty has two spiritual privileges to it. First is that not by your choice, but by the will of God. A simple and absolute acceptance of God's will renders the suffering extremely pure. So we find a number of the saints, they specifically chose to do that, but since this was not under your control, that you're in this state of poverty, that it's even better spiritually if you accept it from God, because you're receiving that and you have that patience through it without being able to have chosen it yourself. And the second spiritual privilege of this kind of real poverty is that it is poorer than that of the religious. A poverty that is despised, rejected, blamed, and abandoned is truly poor. Such then is the poverty of the laity, since they are not poor by their own choice, but by necessity. So you see, those who have taken on poverty, chastity, and obedience as vows in the religious life do so by choice. So they take on poverty by choice. But for the layperson who doesn't take those vows and is living actual poverty, that is something that's it's not done by choice, and so not really seen as wonderful by those in the church. I mean, people will honor those religious because they've made that choice, but very often there's no honor that comes from a layperson who has to live that kind of poverty. But if you do so with this uniting to Jesus and this joy and patience, then it's a poverty that's even greater than that of those that are in religious life, and will do exceedingly much for that growth in holiness. He says, "Do not complain, for if you do, you are no longer poor in spirit." So if somebody who is experiencing poverty complains about it all the time, or compares themselves with somebody who has more, or has this jealousy towards them, that's going to destroy the good that spiritually God can do for those that are going through poverty. He also says, "Do not be ashamed of being poor and of asking for alms and charity." This is nothing to be ashamed of. It doesn't mean you're a worse person than other people. Don't be ashamed to ask for help, especially if it's maybe the case of where for the most part you've been able to take care of things yourself, and then maybe some big thing comes up, some medical bill or something like that, and you need the help of others. Not to be ashamed to get help from family, friends, from the church, from different organizations, Knights of Columbus. Not to be ashamed by that. He says also to receive with humility what will be given to you, and accept the refusal with gentleness. It's very important as well not to feel as though one is entitled to receiving the charitable giving from others. Sometimes you might see that in those that are poor, and they're really lacking a spiritual poverty. This kind of spiritual poverty within real poverty means that, wow, I don't deserve the generosity that you're giving to me. Who am I that God has been able to bring you to help me? And also to accept with gentleness when people don't. Not to become mad at them, not to curse them, but to accept that, well, maybe this was not a time for them to give. He concludes by saying that one who is poor to frequently call to mind the Holy Family in Egypt, and all this poverty, contempt, and suffering they endured. If you follow their example, you will indeed be rich amid your poverty. So those that are experiencing real poverty are like the Holy Family in their poverty. So you're very close to them. And it is very true that especially, when we who are in this richer country go to some place where there's real deep poverty, and often those people are so much happier than we are here in all of our physical richness, because they truly are living that spiritual poverty, that spiritual richness in the midst of their real poverty, just like Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and the Holy Family. God bless.